Hey, and welcome back to Heimler's History. So in Unit 5 of AP World History, we've been talking a lot about the Industrial Revolution. We've been talking about all the fabulous wealth that was generated because of it, all the social changes, all the economic changes, all the political changes. But I should hasten to add that the Industrial Revolution wasn't all poops and giggles. All these massive changes caused some real pushback as industrialization spread throughout the world, and it's that resistance that we're going to talk about in this video. So if you're ready to get your brain cows milked, I'm ready to milk them. Let's get to it. So the first manifestation of resistance to industrialization came from the industrial workers themselves. Factory work was dangerous work. The air inside was stuffy and sickness spread easily. And there were next to no safety regulations protecting workers from exposed machinery. As a result of this, people lost fingers and arms, and there's one story about a woman whose long hair got caught in the machinery and she was scalped. But even with all these liabilities, at least they got paid a decent wage. Yeah, no. They got paid next to nothing because the work that they offered required no skill, and there was a whole line of people who were unemployed who were ready to take your place if you got discontent. Hey, I got 7 good fingers left. I'll take that job. When these factory workers finally went home for the day, they often went home to slums and squalid living conditions and packed themselves so tightly into these new kinds of living spaces called tenements. And because there was no internal plumbing and people lived so closely together, disease spread like mad among tenement dwellers. So there's only so long people can live like that, and so they began to resist, and their resistance took the form of labor unions. Now, a labor union is just a group of workers who organize themselves into a collective so that they can bargain for more than any one worker ever could. Now, these labor unions did not go unopposed, but they were powerful enough to win the following reforms: a 5-day work week, limits on the number of hours worked, and minimum wage laws. Now, once the folks in these labor unions began to realize that they had power in their voice, they assumed that that power could be applied to other areas. And so it's at this point that labor unions began to push for further societal reforms, specifically the franchise, which is to say, the right to vote. And they were right. They were pretty successful in this regard. For example, in Britain, you had to own property to vote, and under the influence of labor unions, this requirement was reduced. And by 1918, the franchise was extended to all men, regardless of property holding, and then 10 years later, it was extended to all women as well. And also under the heading of labor union reform, we need to talk about child labor. See, factory workers loved employing children because they were small and they could pay them 1/10 of what they paid a full-grown man. But when children spend 12 to 14 hours a day in a factory, in many cases they developed physical deformities and in some cases deadly sickness. And so labor unions began to stand up for the children. For example, in 1843, a law was passed in the United States that made it illegal for children under 10 to work in coal mines. Whoa. You're telling me that children under 10 were working in coal mines? That children were boring holes into the earth and shaking hands with the devil, and we were okay with this? Well, yeah, they had tiny fingers and they could get into cracks and crevices that grown men couldn't. Oh, well, when you explain it that way, I'm totally on board. And fun fact, as these industrialized nations are passing child labor laws, now all of a sudden you've got parents in factories and unemployed children running around in the streets causing trouble. And so it is precisely this time when you start seeing laws being passed for mandatory education for children. And you who are watching this are the inheritors of these fair laws. I know school can be hard sometimes, but take heart. At least you're not in a coal mine. Okay, so that was the reaction against industrialization from the workers' perspective. A second kind of resistance came from the thinky people. This is probably too simplistic, but in a way you could say that industrialization on the whole was the result of an idea. And that idea was called free market economics, as outlined in Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations. But the world had changed since the initial implementation of free market economics. At this point, the free market system had led to the rise of multinational corporations and all sorts of applications that were well beyond the scope of Smith's original idea. So different thinkers began to criticize this idea and then openly offer their own remedies. A philosopher by the name of John Stuart Mill criticized capitalism chiefly because it was a selfish system. In capitalism, everyone is out for their own benefit, and Adam Smith argued that if we left them alone in that endeavor, on the whole, individual people would make decisions good for the whole. But John Stuart Mill looked around and saw that people's self-interest, especially the self-interest of the factory owners, was causing an untold amount of harm to the people who were doing the work. And so he offered a different solution, namely utilitarianism. To Mills, the free market had abused workers, and therefore a new mindset was required to correct those abuses. Utilitarianism argued that every individual action ought to be carried out for the happiness of the whole rather than the happiness of the individual. And then you've got Karl Marx, who also jumped in to criticize capitalism. In his mind, society was basically divided in two. At the top, you had the bourgeoisie, and these were the folks who owned the means of production, like factories. Under them were the proletariat, or the working class, and these were the folks who provided the work for the factories. And Marx's chief complaint was that the free market had led to the happiness and flourishing of the bourgeoisie, but to the misery of the proletariat. And as Marx saw it, capitalism as a system virtually required the trampling of the working class for its success. And so Marx outlined his solution for all of this in his most famous writing, the Communist Manifesto. In it, he argued that it was the workers that ought to own the means of production and by consequence share the wealth among them equally. Now, this stage of his plan was called scientific socialism, but it was not the end goal. The end goal was communism, and in this stage, all social classes would be erased from society and everyone would be equal. Okay, so that's how the thinky people reacted to industrialization. Let's go visit our friends the Ottomans and see what they have to say. So in 1808, when Sultan Mahmud II rose to power, he embarked on a large-scale overhaul of the Ottoman state with respect to industrialization. And Mahmud oversaw major reforms in the Ottoman society, like the abolition of the feudal system, the building of an extensive network of roads, and the establishment of a postal service. And his sons continued Mahmud's reforms under a program called Tanzimat. Now, in this phase of the reform movement, the Ottoman legal system was updated to include equality for all before the law. Also, they worked hard to root out long-standing corruption in the government. Additionally, they created secular schools for children, which was kind of a big deal because prior to this, education was handled by the ulama, which is to say the Islamic scholars of the Ottoman Empire. But we're talking about resistance to the spread of industrialization, and everything I just said sounds like large-scale acceptance. So, after the Ottoman society had largely been remade in the image of the Tanzimat reforms, a new sultan rose to power in 1876, namely Abdul Hamid. At the beginning of his rule, he was favorable to the reforms, but that did not last. Kind of like when you're eating pancakes, and at the beginning you're all excited and stuff, and then you eat 12 of them, and by the end, you're sick of them. It's just like that. Anyway, Hamid feared the more radical reformers who went by the names the Young Turks. They were always flapping their mouth holes about the need to replace the monarchy with a constitutional government, and so he went ahead and drove that group of agitators into exile. Additionally, Armenians in the Ottoman Empire called out for reform as well, and Hamid responded by the systematic persecution and massacre of untold numbers of them. Now, we're going to focus on that series of events in Unit 6, so that's all I'll say about it here. Okay, so that's how the Ottomans responded to industrialization. Let's go visit our friends in China and see how they're doing. And just to remind you, during this time, it was the Qing Dynasty who held power. And the Qing leadership realized that their future as an independent China rested squarely on a strong economic capacity, and therefore, the only natural conclusion is, we must modernize. And so they began a period of institutional reform called the self-strengthening movement. This was a lot like the way Japan industrialized. They did it to preserve their culture from any further Western encroachment. While upholding their traditional Confucian values and the power of Qing dynastic rule, really all they wanted from the barbarian Westerners was solid ships and powerful guns. Now, it's enough for me to tell you that these reforms largely failed and the efforts were abandoned. However, a few years later, starting in 1894, the Japanese defeated China in the Sino-Japanese War. And so as a result of that, China's impulse for reform was rekindled and they put in place the 100 Days of Reform. And under these reforms, they abolished the civil service examination, which had been a mainstay in Chinese bureaucracy for like 2 millennia, and that number is probably arguable, but it was a long time. Additionally, they created industrial and commercial systems patterned on Western institutions so that they could compete with Western economies. But again, there was resistance to all this reform. Conservative powers like the Empress Dowager Cixi didn't like the casting off of 2,500 years of tradition in the civil service exam, and she hated the idea of China adopting Western technology, and so she used all her power to resist such reforms. However, after she was made wise to all the corruption that was in the civil service examination, she relented. And so the result of all this back and forth is that China, weakened by internal rebellion, accepted help from Western powers to modernize in exchange for exclusive trading rights in different parts of China. And by accepting their help, I mean accepting their total economic domination and servitude. You know, tomato, tomato. Okay, that's what you need to know about Unit 5, Topic 8 of AP World History. Now, I know a lot of you are new around here, so if that's you, subscribe and come along. If you need help with your AP World History class or the AP World History exam, then go check out my review packet. It's got everything you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam. Heimler out.